O ratu u Ukrajini, stanju u Evropskoj uniji, kao i dešavanjima u regionu, razgovarali smo sa Nikolasom Whytom, stručnjakom za vanjsku politiku i višim direktorom kancelarije APCO u Briselu. Mr. Whyte, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, let me start with the ongoing tragedy in Ukraine. What are your projections after the illegal annexation of the 4 territories of Ukraine by Russia?
I think what's much more interesting is the rapid progress that's being made by the Ukrainian army. At the very moment, we saw the fall of the crucial town of Liman at the weekend, and now we're also seeing progress in the west, in the area around Kherson, specifically the town of Dudchany, which I believe is about to fall. So I think we can see declarations of where the frontiers should be, but the fact is that the force of arms, the balance of military strength, is shifting very strongly in one direction, and that's towards Ukraine. People in general are being quite cautious about this, but I'm not. I would say that we're looking more and more likely that there will be a Ukrainian military victory, and that Russia and the rest of the world will have to adapt themselves to that. So the Russian annexation becomes empty words. It becomes worth less than the paper it is written on.
Well, as you said, the Ukrainians have been making progress in the east, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared partial mobilization in Russia. Do you believe that Putin is weakened by these developments?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for any leader, it never helps if you lose a war, and the Russians have been losing this war since March, since they withdrew from the areas around Kiev. And they've lost still further in the last few weeks when they withdrew from the areas around Kharkiv and the other territory that the Ukrainians have captured in the last few weeks. This is a war that is not going well for Russia. My understanding is that within Russia at the moment, the responsibility is being placed with the military establishment, with the Ministry of Defense and with the army. But the fact is that this was a war chosen by Vladimir Putin. He chose to fight this war. He didn't have to. It was his responsibility. It's his choice. And he will, in the end, have to take the consequences.
Well, we've seen that Ukraine has asked for an expedited membership into NATO. And some member countries have said that now is not the time. How do you view this development?
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, NATO is a conflict prevention organization. So it would be a bit strange to bring in a new member to NATO that is actually involved at this moment in a conflict. That's not the way NATO has usually worked. Having said that, of course, it is a political organization and they can make political choices if they wish. Surprised to see Ukraine joining NATO before this conflict with Russia is over.
Now, speaking of the European Union, you've been a staunch opponent of Brexit in 2016, but we've seen the rise of Euroscepticism and anti-migratory politics all over Europe. What we've seen recently in Sweden and in Italy, among others, the elections have brought a victory to the far-right Eurosceptic parties. Why is this happening, and what does it mean for the future of the EU?
Yeah. First of all, when we say victory, we must be quite careful as to what we're saying here. None of these parties has come near getting a majority of voters behind them to support their programs. What has happened is that they've become big enough to become influential in the formation of centre-right government coalitions. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. It was the case 5 years ago. Actually, the amount of support for these parties hasn't shifted all that much in the last few years, not even this year. But I think it's natural that we see a swing of the pendulum, as it were. For many years, the political consensus was very much towards cooperation on the classical kind of Schuman model on which the European Union was constructed. The Schuman Declaration was in 1958, which is almost almost 10 years before I was born, and I'm 55. I think that it's natural that we see national interests becoming more important to voters in the way that they make their choices. Now, you mentioned immigration. This has really decreased quite a lot. We had the major crisis due to the Syrian conflict in 2015, but we haven't seen a repeat of the same sorts of rhetoric with the refugees coming from Ukraine this year. We can talk about why that might be, but I just want to make the point that we're not seeing the same level of xenophobia that we did, unfortunately, a few years ago. So I think that's an important thing to note. I think it's also interesting that a lot of the right-wing parties have moderated their rhetoric in order to get into power. We've seen, for instance, Mrs. Meloni, who has just won in Italy. We've seen that she has shifted completely from being opposed to the European Union to being very much in favour of it, if she feels that she can progress Italy's interests through membership. And to a lesser extent, we're seeing that with Mrs. Le Pen and the Rassemblement National in France, and we're seeing it with the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. So one of the lessons is that extremists who want to get closer to power need to become less extreme. I'm sorry that the extremist vote is increasing, but I'm interested that their politics is also changing when this happens.
Well, a lot of these Eurosceptic European parties have been against also the enlargement of the European Union. Now, what is your view of the European perspective of the Western Balkans? And now, obviously, especially Montenegro. I know you've followed the region closely.
Yes, I've been following this for, I think, nearly 25 years now, this issue. Look, enlargement has not been a priority of this European Commission in this mandate. We know the reasons for some of this. We had a global pandemic in the last 2 years, and we're seeing a strong concentration on the environmental and on the digital policies of the European Union. And enlargement negotiations with a small number of relatively small countries hasn't had the same priority that it did in the days when Olli Rehn and Günther Verheugen were European commissioners dealing with this issue. Having said that, you know, the mechanisms remain there, and the ultimate course for the Western Balkan countries remains clear. If you're going to, it's in a sense, it's the British dilemma, but in reverse. If you're going to have fruitful economic relations with your largest economic neighbour, which is the European Union, you're going to have to adapt your economic system to the European model. It's as simple as that. And if you don't, you pay an economic price, which the British are now paying for having decided to distance themselves. So we will see the continued implementation of EU law in all the Western Balkan countries. And we will see internal pressure in the European Union to deliver on the promises that they have made. It's not going as fast as I would have liked. I don't think we're going to see European Union membership for any of the Western Balkan countries in the next 2 years, the remainder of the current Commission's mandate. I think it's possible that we might see, for instance, Montenegro coming pretty close to membership in the following mandate, from 2024 to 2029. So the direction remains forward. We can query that in the case of 1 or 2 countries. The historical momentum points in one direction rather than the other. And I'm sure that we will see countries deciding that they've had enough of waiting, and I totally understand and sympathise with that frustration. But in the end, there isn't another way to go.
Well, what about the Open Balkans initiative? Is it a distraction, let's say, from the European perspective of Western Balkans countries? Some have said that it is a way to keep them outside of the EU. And what seems confusing, it seems to have the support of the U.S. representatives in the region. How do you explain this, and why do they support it? Who does this benefit?
Yeah, look, the EU has always wanted to see stronger regional integration alongside the integration of the region into the EU. I'm one of the people that has always been a bit sceptical about this. Your country became independent for a reason. I was very much involved with the debates around Montenegro's independence at the time that it was happening. And I think that some people within the EU don't appreciate where Montenegro has come from, where Albania has come from, where Bosnia-Herzegovina has come from. At the same time, you know, there are limits to how far such an integration project can go for exactly this reason. I don't see any harm, for instance, in the roaming initiative so that people don't have to pay higher mobile telephone charges between different countries of the region. I don't see any particular harm in having a common travel area. I agree that this must never become a distraction from the main prize, which is European integration. But I think the burden of explanation needs to be towards those who are favouring this initiative to explain exactly how far they want it to go and to defend the continuing EU integration of the region, which is a much more important priority.
And would you say that the Serbian president, Vučić, is the stabilizing force in the region?
And it seems to me that the relationship with Kosovo is the most fragile of internal relationships in Bosnia. And these are the two things that have the greatest potential to cause instability. And it's clear that Serbia is a very strong player in both of those. And I know we'll talk about Bosnia in a moment, so let me talk about Kosovo first. The fact is that the Belgrade Agreement from, I think it was 2013, if possibly 2014, I forget the exact year now. But the agreement has not been implemented by both sides. But the stronger responsibility lies on Serbia, because Serbia is the country that is in the stronger position, the party to the agreement that is in the stronger position. Serbia needs to be clear, Kosovo will never again be under Serbian rule. Whether Serbia chooses to call that independence or not is a matter for Serbia, but Serbia must start behaving as if it is next door to a normal, independent, fully functioning neighbour state, and stop interfering in Kosovo's governance. And that also means, this I say in every interview, Jana, so I say it again to you, this also means Serbia needs to move very fast, very quickly, to fulfill its obligations to return the cadastral records to Kosovo, which were stolen by the retreating Serbs in 1999. To do that indicates that Serbia accepts the authority of Kosovo institutions on the territory of Kosovo. They have signed documents that say that. Now they need to actually take the implementing steps, and the return of the cadastral records would be a very important first step. And the fact that this has not been done by President Vučić, I think that fact says something.
Speaking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, I know that I have to ask, how do you view the results of yesterday's election, and what do you think of the High Representative Christian Schmidt's initiative on the electoral law?
Yeah. First of all, we're talking on Monday, and we're still waiting for the results to come through. I don't find anything very surprising in the Bosnian election results. I think that we could have expected, there are always people who feel a bit optimistic that this is finally going to be the change election. I don't know why they thought this was going to be the election in which things changed. It's a case where we have found out again the things that we already knew. I think the intervention by the High Representative should have been done at a different time. I think that it is not a good look. It does not help to change the election law on the day that the election takes place. I've had a look through the changes. I see what the intent is. I mean, they repair some defects in the constitution of the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is to say the smaller part of the country, the entity that is not Republika Srpska, which indeed had some serious governance issues. But I don't understand why those changes needed to be made on the night of the election. I don't think that is helpful. I don't think that is I don't think that is a step that is going to restore trust in the process. And it also seems to me that we need to ask how much longer the High Representative should remain in Bosnia. To have a High Representative with bomb powers, so-called, the power to impose political change on Bosnia that the Bosnian institutions did not vote for. I think that was excusable while Bosnia remained a security threat. I'm not sure that Bosnia is a security threat right now. There is a unified army, there's a unified defense ministry, the war criminals have all been arrested and have all been on trial. So I don't see what the strong case is, or I would like to hear what the strong case is for the High Representative to remain in office and continue to exercise those powers.
I do have to ask, have the Western allies learned from their mistakes in Bosnia in the 90s when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
It's a very different situation. In the Balkan Wars, the West did not intervene at any stage until Kosovo in 1999, and arguably not even then, to support one side rather than the other. In Ukraine, the West has not intervened in terms of direct military assistance, but from the very first day of the conflict, the West has been supporting the Ukrainian government in its struggle to defend its own territory. Now, did they learn that they should have supported the Bosnian government in 1992 or the Croatian government or any other case? I don't think that people would make the same parallel. I don't think that people would see the two situations as similar to each other. I think that if anything, the lesson that has been learned is perhaps more recent from the prolonged military operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And that has discouraged the West from sending soldiers directly to Ukraine to participate in the war as combatants from Western countries. I think that is that, rather than the Balkan experience, has encouraged the West to simply provide aid rather than to directly engage.
Well, European leaders will meet at the Prague summit this week, and President of Montenegro, Milo Đukanović, will also be there. This initiative promoted by France has caused some controversy, and it seems to be more beneficial to the far Eastern European countries than to a way to communicate with them and to bring them closer to the EU, more so than the countries of the Western Balkans. How do you think this initiative will develop, and could it be beneficial perhaps to the countries in the Western Balkans?
I think that's not a fair summary, to be honest. I think a good comparison here is with the Council of Europe, which sits in Strasbourg and which brings together all of the European countries on issues of human rights and fundamental laws. And Montenegro has made a very strong contribution to the Council of Europe and its work since Montenegro became independent. And I think that President Macron of France has been thinking about the sorts of European structures that can include the countries that have no prospect of joining the European Union anytime soon. And that, frankly, includes Turkey and the United Kingdom, as well as the Western Balkans. And it quite possibly includes Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, even though they have now put forward their membership applications. and it certainly includes Belarus and the Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I think it's not a bad thing to have a forum for discussion of common threats, particularly in the climate change situation, which is an existential threat to all of us. And my feeling would be that a small country that decides to exploit this opportunity can do rather well. I'll give you a slightly strange example from an old diplomat, a friend of mine, who was involved with the negotiations in Belgrade in the 1970s that led to the creation of the OSCE ultimately. And he said that when it came down to negotiating the German language version of the text, the key country was the small principality of Liechtenstein, because the West Germans and the East Germans did not trust each other. Austria at that point took a neutral position and and the same was true of Switzerland, and they felt reluctant to intervene too much in the debate. And it was Liechtenstein that took the lead in making sure that the German texts that were being agreed were in fact acceptable to all sides. So I think that these structures can offer opportunities for smaller countries if they wish to participate in them. In particular, I'm struck that the British have decided to pick this one up and run with it. You will find very few people in the British government who will say out loud that British influence has decreased as a result of Brexit, but they all know that it's true. And this is one way for them to climb back inside the room where it happened.
Well, I have one last question for you, and it is about Montenegro. Are you following the current political situation, and what do you make of it?
Oh, I feel there's limited value in me as an outsider commenting on the details of what is happening. I would say that what has happened for Montenegro is that for the first time there has not been a clear parliamentary majority as a result of the last elections, and that naturally leads to an unstable situation. I think Montenegro's politicians are going to have to learn that this is normal rather than exceptional. My suspicion is that the next few elections will also deliver similarly divided parliaments, and political leaders are going to have to learn how better to work with each other. And as I look at the dynamics of what's happened over the last few years since the last elections, it struck me that internal coordination, both within the government and indeed within the political parties more generally, has not been very good. And it's been because the political situation previously was different and politicians did not need to learn those skills. Now they do. We're in a different time now.
Mr. Whyte, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Jana. It's been a pleasure.